point of this series is to really kind of look around and kind of say that, when I'm dealing with challenging circumstances, when I'm dealing with difficulties, it can be really easy to kind of want to give up. And the harder success seems, the easier it is, or the more likely we are to want to give up. And so in the series, what we're trying to do is kind of look at what are those tactics and techniques that we can use, and what are those practices that we can adopt to help us to kind of carry on when it seems like against all odds, success is just out of reach. And so we're doing this by walking through the book of Esther. Now, as I mentioned last week, Esther is one of my favorite books of the Old Testament. And it's a pretty amazing story because it's about this young girl who faces incredible odds. Over and over again, she faces incredible odds and yet continues to kind of prevail, continues to push on. Remember when we met Esther last week, she's part of the nation of Israel, but she's under Persian rule. In other words, they've been conquered by another nation, and they're under this large empire of Persia. And she's an orphan. She's lost both of her parents, but fortunately she does have someone to raise her cousin Mordecai, who cares about her. And so they're kind of the heroes of this narrative. But now, we find that Esther got caught up in this kind of really terrible event, that the king of Persia gets tired of one queen, decided he wants a new queen, so he has this kind of outlandish contest to kind of gather up the young women throughout his empire and decide which one should become queen. And Esther gets swept up in that. And it's a terrible situation, right? Because once you were selected to be part of that contest, you never go back home. If you are not selected to be queen, you're just kind of sent off somewhere else in the palace. You live out your days. You never see your family again. Yes, you will have food and shelter, but not much of a life. The only kind of relatively good outcome is becoming queen. And she's up against hundreds, if not thousands, of other girls. And one of the things we see as we watch Esther, and we watch Esther deal with these really difficult circumstances, is that when she sees her challenges, she kind of recognizes those as challenges, and she does something that's so important, that she's willing to do what's difficult. And we saw that last week, that as she was caught up in this thing that she wanted nothing to be a part of, she much rather would have just gone home, but that wasn't an option. So she did what she could do, and she ultimately prevails and becomes queen. And that's the thing I want to kind of focus on today as we go through this series or go through the message today, is that in order to kind of prevail when we're in some really difficult circumstance, it can be an illness that we just wish we didn't have. It could be recovering from a loss and trying to get our lives back on track when it seems so hard. We often have to make really difficult choices. It can be so easy to say, you know what, I'm just not going to try anymore. I just don't want to deal with this anymore. I'm just going to wait right here where I am. And when times are challenging, we have to be willing to do what is difficult. And Esther really demonstrates that. And this comes up in all aspects of our lives. Certainly things like illnesses and loss, but also just our personal lives, our professional lives. That the harder it is to prevail, or the more difficult the circumstance, more likely the more difficult things we have to do in order to be successful. And Esther really kind of lives that out. We saw she had kind of one challenge last week, and her challenges are just beginning. So as we pick up with the narrative, Esther is now queen of Persia. Now that's a pretty big deal. It's one of the largest empires of its time. We're about 2,500 years ago. Persia ruled over what we're told is 127 provinces. So it rules over many other things that were once countries. And so she's now the queen. But as we talked about, this is not a queen with authority. The king's in charge. There's no illusions that she has power. But she does have privilege. She is well cared for. And she does appear to have influence. Because after she becomes queen, her cousin Mordecai gets a very kind of high responsibility, high respect position in the kingdom. Although it doesn't sound like it. He gets the job of standing at the king's gate, Sounds really exciting, right? You guys want to sign up? It's like I had that job at Walmart, right? Right, sort of thing, right? But it's actually a really important job because one thing is that it shows that you are respected, because the King's Gate is the area in the palace complex that leads into the inner circle where the king himself is, as well as his high officials. So to be allowed to stand there means that you are highly trusted. You are also a person that if disputes arise throughout that city, you're someone who helps resolve those. So it's actually a position of respect, and to some degree, authority. And also, because he is so close to the inner circle of the palace, he can maintain his relationship with Esther. He can't necessarily see her anytime he wants, but he does have the ability to see her from time to time. So it's kind of a good thing, but he's also kind of in this kind of an odd circumstance as well. Because if you know anything about the history of kind of royal empires, whether it's the United Kingdom, whether it's Persia, any others, that inner court of the royals is kind of a mess. Right? These are all people who are trying to climb to the top of the ladder. Right? There's political battles going all the time. There is intrigue and disputes all the time. And so Mordecai finds himself kind of in the midst of all that. And we don't get the sense that Mordecai is really a political guy. It doesn't seem like he's really trying to do those sort of things. But turns out he overhears something really important. He overhears two of the attendants of the king plotting to kill the king. Now, it's kind of interesting, right? I don't think he is a big fan of the king, given what the king has done to Esther. So he might be tempted to say, you know what? Not my problem. Let it go. But if someone wants to kill the king, that means they want to put someone new in charge. And again, if you know anything about the history of royal courts, if you kill the king, who else do you kill? Their entire family. So that means that if someone's plotting to kill the king, Esther's life is in danger. And so Mordecai takes a big chance. He actually overhears this, and it says that Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. Now again, this is a huge stepping out for Mordecai, because if he could overhear other people talking about the plot, he risks other people hearing him tell Esther what's going on. So that means he's risking his own life to save Esther. And that really tells us how much he cares about Esther. So he does this so he can protect Esther. And we're told that once he told Esther, she then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. So it turns out it works out okay, right? So now that the king knows about the plot, the king takes care of it, kind of punishes those who are behind it. And this kind of helps out Mordecai a little bit, because the king knows that Mordecai helped save his life. So it's not that they're going to be, beer buddies hanging out all the time, right? But basically, the king is going to have a favorable view of Mordecai. So it seems like they should be in pretty good shape at this point, right? Esther is the queen, so she's got access to a lot of things. Mordecai has favor with the king. So everything should just be perfect, right? That's how your life works, right? You get one good thing and everything's just smooth sailing from then on out, right? Well, it doesn't happen in your life, doesn't happen in my life, and it doesn't happen for Mordecai and Esther either. Because if Mordecai and Esther are the heroes of our story also has a villain, a guy named Haman. Now, Haman is a mean, nasty, arrogant, entitled man. I don't like Haman, in case you're wondering. But he's a nasty man, he's a mean man, and he feels very entitled. But he finds himself in very favorable position. And we think that Haman is someone who is probably very politically adept, very good at kind of climbing the ladder. Because the narrative tells us, sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. What they're saying is that Haman has now been appointed to a place where he has more power than every single human being in the kingdom except the king himself. Now, maybe that's concerning, maybe it's not. But that other word, Agagite, that tells us something really important. Now, it's kind of an odd word. In fact, it is the only time in the Bible this word appears. An Agagite, literally what it means is a descendant of Agag. Agag was an enemy of the Israeli people about 500 years earlier. So what it means in this case, today we would say he's anti-Semitic. That he's a person who hates everyone from the nation of Israel. That is kind of his default stance. He's a racist. And that's the man who's now in charge. And the thing is that this is a position of high power that's supposed to be respected. In fact, the narrative tells us that all the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. Now that's fine, because most of these high-ranking officials are Persians or other non-Jewish people. But Mordecai knows who this guy is. And Mordecai is being asked to pay respect to a man who doesn't just hate him, which I think he probably could have tolerated, but hates his entire race. And so Mordecai takes a stand. It says that Mordecai refused to bow down or show Haman respect. Now, is that a good decision by Mordecai? Maybe yes, maybe no. We could argue that out of respect for the king, he should have done what the king requested. But for Mordecai, this is too big an issue. That Haman is a terrible person. And he's a person who would do harm given the chance. So Mordecai says, I'm not going to respect someone like that. I am not going to bow down. I am not going to show him respect. And the thing is that Haman is the kind of guy who notices that. Because he likes it. He loves when he walks through and people bow down to him. He actually kind of eats it all up. So the thought that someone would not give that to him is infuriating. In fact, it says that when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. So the simple fact that someone wouldn't bow down actually sends him to a rage. And he actually starts trying to plot how to harm Mordecai. In other words, he is so upset he is willing to do Mordecai great harm. But then his idea begins to grow. Said that Haman had learned of Mordecai's nationality. So he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire. So that initial assessment of Haman is pretty accurate. A guy doesn't bow down to you and you decide, I'm going to kill him, but not only him, and not only his family, but everyone of his race I am going to destroy. And it gives Haman something to really focus on. Now, we might blame Mordecai for all this. It's like, geez, Mordecai, if you just would have bowed down, you could have avoided all this. But I'm going to say that a guy who's willing to wipe out an entire race over someone not bowing down would have found another reason real soon to do the same thing. But here's the thing. Haman wants to do this, and he's really powerful, but he's not that kind of powerful. As much power as he has in his position, he cannot order the slaughtering of an entire race of people who are under the king's kingdom. But who can? The king. So Haman has to come up with a way to convince the king to authorize the killing of the entire Jewish race. Now, how can he do that? I mean, Haman can't walk in and say, hey, Mordecai upset me, let's kill everybody. Because the king knows that Mordecai helped save his life. So the king is going to be favorable towards Mordecai. But as we said, that Haman is a mean, nasty, arrogant man, but he's also a very resourceful man. He's very good at getting what he wants. So he comes up with a plan. And it's a very familiar plan, particularly in the time we live in now. He comes up with this kind of boogeyman story. You know, in other words, as opposed to talking about the real problem and the issues behind it and what was going on, he says, hey, king, you know what? There's this entire group of people in your kingdom, and they're strange. They're different from other people. And you know what they do? They actually keep to themselves. Oh, no. And they follow their own laws, which the Jewish people did. But they also followed the king's laws. I mean, they followed their own stricter way of living. They ate a certain way. They worked a certain way. But they also followed the king's laws. But basically what Haman did is he walked in and just started describing their differences. How often does that happen? Is that not literally the political environment that we live in? We don't talk about the real issues. We just talk about the differences, and they're going to take yours and all those sort of things. And apparently, as well as it works today, 2,500 years ago, it worked just as well. Because as he describes all this to the king starts kind of buying into it, going, oh, wow, we should really be concerned about this. In fact, Haman goes on to say that this is a threat to your entire kingdom. If you don't deal with these people, it could really damage your whole kingdom. Now, Haman's done a really good job at this point, but he wants to really be sure that he's sold the king. So he leverages something about the king that he knows, something that we all know, actually. Now, I know it's been a week ago, but if you think back a week, when we very first met King Xerxes, do you remember what he was doing? Throwing a huge celebration to show off all his wealth. I am so rich. I am so important. And so Haman knows that that is something that the king loves, this idea of wealth. So to assure that Haman can get the king to sign off on this genocide, Haman tells us that if it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed. And I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury. In other words, this is so important that I care about your kingdom so much that I'll do all the work to organize this for you. And I'll also put up enough money to cover any expenses that go along with it. And there'll be a bunch left over. And to give a sense of how much money he's offering, the original language doesn't say sacks of silver. It actually says 10,000 talents of silver. It's a measure of money. We estimate it's about 750,000 pounds of silver. So at today's rates, that's worth like $15 million, sort of thing. In their time frame, it takes the kingdom about 8 months to make that money. So across the entire empire, that's about 8 months worth of income. So the king's like, oh, wow, they must really be bad people. You mean you want to get rid of them and you want to give me money to let you do it? They must be really terrible people. So the king said, the money and the people are both yours, to do with as you see fit. So the king signs off on allowing Haman to write a decree to wipe them out. So basically, a decree is written that will be sent throughout the lands, and it's in the king's name, so throughout the entire empire, giving people permission to execute every Jewish person they can find. Now, that's a big thing, right? I mean, I think a lot of people might say, I don't know why you want me to do that. Why would you expect me to do that? Because they're not using the army, they're using the people. But Haman understands what motivates people. And oh yeah, if you kill them, you can have their wealth. So again, Haman keeps leveraging money to get people to do things. And the king authorizes all of this. But the king is also mindful of the fact that he does not want just this kind of ongoing rampage in his kingdom. So he tells Haman that you can do this, but it has to just be on one day. So basically, you can have a genocide, but it's just got to happen all on the same day. Right? So Haman, realizing that he's only got one shot to pull this off, wants to make sure that the fates are with him. In other words, he's being a bit superstitious. So he wants to be sure that he picks the right date, the best date to do this. So he does something called casting lots. And right, so it's just a way of kind of finding a random value. Could have been sticks that they threw or something they draw off, something like that. And the date ends up being almost a year away. But that's what the fates have selected. So they write an edict, send it out into the kingdom that on this date, roughly 12 months from now, you are called to kill all the people of Israel around you, and you can get their wealth if you'll do it. Now, of course, what's this going to do for all the Israeli people, all the Jewish people in the area? They now have a clock ticking. That literally every day they wake up, they now know that they are one day closer to an attempt to wipe them out. So, of course, the whole nation goes into mourning. But here's the thing that's kind of interesting, is that Esther is the queen. She's actually Israeli, but she hasn't told anybody. Remember, she has not told anybody that she's Israeli. And she's completely unaware of any of it. Because remember, her position is not a position of power. Right? Again, it's a position of privilege. You know, she goes to banquets, she spends time with the king, but nobody bothers to tell her what's going on. So eventually she hears something that disturbs her, though. She hears that her cousin Mordecai is openly crying and wailing in the streets. And he's wearing clothes of mourning. And it's a Jewish tradition that when you're in mourning, there's certain clothing that you wear. And she has no idea why. So she sends a servant out inviting Mordecai to come in and tell her what's going on. And he even refuses to even come inside where she's at. So they have this exchange between a servant, and they're having this incredibly important conversation. But it's kind of got to be kind of, it's kind of like, email days apart sort of thing, right? One side says something, you got to wait for the reply. The other side says something. And what she finds out is that Mordecai first sends in a message and says, this is what's going on. A decree has been signed to wipe out all of your people. Haman's the guy behind it. He's given the king money to make sure this goes through. And there are certain kind of things the king can issue that once they're issued cannot be reversed. This is that kind of decree. There's no way back from all this unless you can come up with something. So Mordecai says, what you need to do is you're the queen. You need to go to the king and you need to beg him to find a way to turn this around. Now that seems like a reasonable request, except Esther doesn't really see it as reasonable. Esther actually sees it as very unreasonable. In fact, we'll find out that Esther is actually terrified by this request. Because when she replies back to Mordecai, she gives her message to the servant to take back to Mordecai, she says that all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. She's saying that you're asking me to do something that puts my life in danger, and you know it. That's why she opens up the way that she does. Everybody knows you can't do that. And to be clear, the rule was, at least according to the text, the rule was that if you walked in to see the king and he had not invited you, you were captured and executed automatically. He didn't even have to say anything unless he personally stepped in. That was the end of you. Now, we might be, but you're the queen, right? Aren't you okay? You should be fine. Right? Well, she adds something. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. In other words, she doesn't get to see the king every day. The king has lots of wives and other companions as well. She's the queen, which is kind of a special case. But even she can only see him when he calls for her. And he hasn't bothered to invite her in a month. So Esther says, you think I have all this ability to affect things? Let me tell you how things are going in my life right now. That he's interested in all those other women right now. He hasn't bothered to call me. He's not interested in me at all. I'm not really in a position to help you out right now. I'm just trying to survive myself. And that's the message she sends back to Mordecai. She feels that she is being asked to do something unreasonable, that's something that is difficult and is not something that she can do. Now, as that information comes back to Mordecai, he's not happy. He realizes that he's asking her to do something really difficult. But he wants her to understand how important this is and how she is positioned perfectly to deal with this. Because Mordecai sent back his reply. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. And this makes a really good point, right? Specific to the story, what's happening is that Esther has got a pretty comfortable life now, right? She didn't even know this was going on. If Mordecai hadn't have told her, she wouldn't even have known. So basically, Mordecai is saying that you think because you're comfortable now, everything is going to be okay for you? It's not. And I think that's something that we need to be abundantly aware of in our lives. Right? That when things are getting difficult, when the world around us is changing, when things are going away that we wish they didn't, we can't just sit back and ignore them. We need to choose to be a part of what's going on. Right? That applies to our lives now, whatever it might be, and applied very much to Esther. as Mordecai continues, he says, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. And it's kind of funny because up to this point, this doesn't really feel like much of a Bible story, much of a religious story, right? It just seems to be about people in tension. But Mordecai has kind of brought that back around. Mordecai's reminding Esther, remember where you started. And he's not putting her down, just saying, how much of a long shot was it for you to come from where you were through that system of contesting, to become queen? That was an incredible long shot. It's really possible that maybe God was in that you got to where you were, not just because of your own hard work, although that was really important, but maybe God has positioned you there. And maybe you're there right this minute so you can do something about what's going on. So don't just rest on the fact that you feel like you're okay right now, because God has a plan. God is at work right now. Do you want to be a part of it or not? And I think that's the big question in all of our lives. When we are involved in things, when God is moving around us, whether it's helping people who are in need, whether it's supporting one another, whether it's being honest with each other in our difficulties, whether it's sharing life with one another, it can be very easy to kind of stand back and say, well, I'm doing okay. I don't really need to get into all that mess. It's a lot of work. It's kind of hard to get into all that mess. And I think what we see from Mordecai is that God is moving all around us all the time. But if we just choose our comfort, as opposed to looking for opportunities to make a difference, we miss out. That God is doing things around us all the time. God is changing lives around us all the time. And so do we want to be a part of it or not? Right? That's the question. Do we want to just sit back where we're comfortable? Or do we want to choose to do what's difficult? To make a difference in someone else's life? That's the question before us. It's the question before Esther. He's making the point that, yes, I know this is a difficult situation, but you are in a position to do what no one else can do. And you've heard me say this as long as I've been here, and so are you, and so am I. I don't mean to point at you, sorry. We are all in a position to make a difference in someone else's life like no one else is. There is someone that you know who you can help. There's someone that you know who is going through something. There is someone that you know who may be unwilling to kind of learn a little bit about God, a little bit about Jesus, and you may be the one person that can talk to them, to get them to try it out. It's not your job to convince them, right? We don't kind of push that sort of thing, but just invite someone out to come out and check it out. You can reach people that no one else can reach. You are in a position to do things that no one else can do. No one else will do the things exactly the way you do. No one can reach certain people that you can reach. That's the invitation to all of us, to look around and see the difference that we can make. And as Mordecai presents this point to Esther, she kind of finally sees it. Because after she hears that from Mordecai, she sends back her reply. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, which is just the city where they're at. So go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. Basically, what she's saying is, I need your support. Pray for me in this. As part of Jewish tradition, when they're mourning, their prayer includes fasting. She says, so for 3 days, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to start to pray. I'm going to ask God for guidance. I'm going to ask God for a plan. I'm going to ask God for courage. I'm going to ask God what I should do. And I want you to do the same thing. I'm going to ask all of my friends to do that for me. She says to Mordecai, please ask everyone you know to do the same thing. And then, when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. She's saying that this is a big ask. What you're asking me to do is huge, and it's scary. But she also knows that Mordecai faced a very similar situation when he saved the king, because it saved her. By trying to get the message about someone trying to kill the king, Mordecai risked his own life to save her. He's saying that you have that same opportunity now. Right? I did that for you. Do this for them. I did it just to save you, one person. You could save hundreds of thousands of people. So step out and be willing to do that. And we never know what our personal influence is for each of us. We never know whether the things we do will affect one life, 2 lives, 10 lives, or 100. But what we do know is that if we don't try, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. And that's exactly what Esther is saying here. I'll try. If God is in it, I guess I'll make it. If God's not, at least I was queen for a while. So I think she's going to give it a go. But I think she also gives us a really important roadmap. That when we step out to do things that are difficult, because I believe that we are all called to do things that are bigger than we are capable of. That God invites us to make a bigger difference than we actually can on our own. But if we're going to do that, we've got to not try to do it all on our own. So what does Esther do? She starts by praying about it. Okay, God, I'm going to step out and do something new. Or I'm going to step out and do something scary. I'm scared. Help me through this. And notice that she doesn't just kind of toss up a help me Jesus sort of prayer, right? Not that there's anything wrong with that, by the way. I've had a few of those myself. But this one is serious, and it has planning. And so she's treating it like something that can be planned. And so she spends a great deal of time getting ready for it, centering herself on God, clearing her head, looking at the scale of what's in front of her. And I think that as we go through our lives and as we try to do bigger things and as we see opportunities to do bigger things, that relationship with God is so important. Because when we're doing smaller things, we can often pull them off on our own. But as we try to do bigger things, it gets to where we can't pull them off on our own. In fact, there's kind of a classic line that if your dreams don't scare you, they're not big enough. Right? That's in front of all of us. That there's something we can all do that's a little bit bigger than we're comfortable with, a little bit scary for us. But if we're going to do that, we've got to recognize that we are not in it alone, that God is in it with us. And so we seek his guidance to see what we can actually achieve when we do that. So, what about Esther? She spends her 3 days in prayer. She gets herself all set. She walks to see the king. And we'll find out what happens there next week.